Hello, BookTube. I'm continuing on with our read-along of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. I'm doing this with David Murphy, and we're doing a read-along that's a bit odd. It's a bit unconventional in a couple of ways. The first one of which is that we're doing a chapter a day, every weekday, of this book. Instead of saving it all up for the end of the month and just talking about it in one blast, we're doing a chapter every day until we run out of chapters. Uh, and the other slightly unconventional thing about this read-along is that we're not consulting with each other. We found each other on Voxer, and we aren't doing it. Even though we know how to, we're not. So I don't know what he's going to say about every chapter of this book until I watch his videos. Uh, and so I don't know, since there's no coordination, I don't know how our videos are going to match up in terms of their analysis of each chapter. There have been times where he goes on for 7 minutes and I go on for 30 minutes. There have been times when, well, it's never really reversed. I have a tough time with brevity. But the chapter that we're reading today this is chapter 11 of the book. We're about halfway done, and this chapter makes me wonder what the disparities in our video treatments will be. The chapter is The Lowly Stamp of Their Origin, Religion's Corrupt Beginnings. I mentioned last time that the quote from Darwin there, and the title might lead you to think this is going to be some sort of biological treatment, but instead it's about origins, about how religions and religious cults take over, how they start. And I mentioned in an earlier video that the religious people ought to be grateful, that oftentimes the very beginnings of their religious movements are shrouded in mystery. They ought to be grateful for that fact, because the beginnings will tend to look terrible. The beginnings tend to be the most obvious sign of what Hitchens says throughout this book, which is that religions are man-made. And this chapter proves that. Hitchens goes through three examples. He gives three examples. There's the Melanesian cargo cults, where natives of infrequently visited islands who were visited by the U.S. Army Corps or the Navy Corps of Engineers and given cast-off supplies, built a religious movement around the return of those people who they claim to see as sort of gods. So their religious figures were, for instance, John Frum, as in John from the Navy. And they built docks for Navy ships as kinds of temples to propitiate the gods. And Hitchens treats it in a few paragraphs. It's a favorite hobby horse for the new atheists. I don't mean to go into too much of a digression, but it doesn't bear much in the way of scrutiny, that whole story. When you see a story, look at this, the natives of an isolated island in the modern day were visited by servicemen from the United States Navy, didn't understand what they were, and started to worship them and created a whole religion around them, complete with 10 Commandments and a Trinity and modes of religion, and excluding people who don't observe those modes correctly, all happening in the modern day, and all about something completely secular, the U.S. military service. When you see something like that, something that is literally too good to be true, it probably is. But Hitchens uses that as one of his examples, and then he uses a mid-20th century charismatic child preacher named Marjo, who was later the subject of a movie, of a documentary where he exposes his own fraud. And Hitchens finishes up with the Church of Latter-day Saints, with Joseph Smith and the Mormons. And that's what the chapter is. And that makes me curious to know, to see what kind of a treatment David will give it, because there isn't much to do with this. Hitchens picks three very tawdry beginnings of three religious-themed things. The Melanesian cargo cults, which is... Let's just say no serious anthropology has ever been done on the Melanesian cargo cults, and the anthropology that has been done has more holes than a block of Swiss cheese. If something looks too good to be true, then it probably is. And the whole task of exposing Marjo for the fraud that he was done by him himself. All Hitchens has to do is just relate the whole incident, which he does fairly well. This is a fairly enjoyable chapter, and of course, Joseph Smith has been brochetted a million times, including in lots better and more thoughtful ways than what Hitchens does. He trots it around the block for a few pages, but there have been whole books on the subject, whole lecture series, a great segment of Julia Sweeney's comedy lecture tour that she did throughout the country, Letting Go of God, was about her encounter with two teenage Mormon missionaries, and it's hilarious. It's funnier than anything that Hitchens does. But that is the whole chapter. Is Hitchens basically trying to underscore the point that I made the other day, which is that many, many other people have made, which is that when you see religions in their beginnings, they look their most vulnerable. That is when they look their most contrived. It's when you see them in the fullness of their age with a huge amount of accumulated ritual that they start to look like more than what they are. And that's the whole that the chapter is about. So I don't really have much to say on chapter 11 of God is Not Great. And next time, tomorrow, we're just going to keep going throughout this week. Next time is chapter 12, and I have a feeling I'm going to have even less to say about chapter 12, because it's another one of those tiny things. We saw one already on the brief digression about Ham that was 10 paragraphs long, and I think chapter 12 of God is Not Great is even shorter than that. I think it might be 7 or 8 paragraphs long. And it's just about how various religious movements end. And there's no attempt, like with the way they begin, there's no attempt at systematic analysis. There's no attempt at drawing any kind of larger picture or maybe threads that aren't obvious on the surface. There's very little in the way, there's narration, but there's very little in the way of work on the part of the author, any author. So I don't know that there'll be much to say. We get on to meatier stuff in a bit. This week we'll hit a couple of really meaty chapters. But for right now, that is chapter 11 of God is Not Great. Just 3 stories stitched together. They're not even the same story, because there's the cargo cults, there's whatever Mormonism is, and then there's the beginning not of a religion, but of a charismatic preaching career. So no more attempt than that was taken to give the chapter any kind of thematic unity, and so there isn't, I think, not much to talk about. We'll see if David comes up with more, but otherwise we'll just reconvene tomorrow for what I suspect will be another short God is Not Great video. We'll see. The ending of religions is at least a rarer topic, so we'll reconvene then and see what we make of it. Thank you, BookTube.